Good morning from Scotts Valley. Amazing. So glad you invited folks from LA to learn more. Awesome. Here to learn about how to implement good policy in your local region. That's incredible. Hi from NYC. Learning more about how policy can help human rights in the fashion supply chain. That's wonderful. So important. Well, thank you all for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're still admitting folks into the waiting room. Hi from New Jersey. Hi from NYC. So wonderful that you're all here to learn more about fair fashion policy. We're so glad to have you. If you're new here, thanks for joining us. We're with Remake, and Remake is a global advocacy organization working to ensure all of fashion's essential workers have safe and sustainable jobs of dignity. We're dropping in the chat a sign-up link for the Remake Ambassador Program. If you're new to our work, we'd love for you to check that out. And here today, we're going to talk about why worker-centric, justice-focused fashion policy is needed. We'll discuss why this kind of justice lens orientation matters, how Remake as an organization analyzes if a policy is worker-centric and justice-oriented, and we'll give you the tools in our toolbox so that you can make informed decisions as well to ensure that worker voice is represented in fashion policy. We're also joined by our wonderful partners at the Garment Workers Center, Anahi and Gloria. Thank you for being here. Who we've been fighting arm in arm with to pass first the Garment Worker Protection Act and then the proposed Federal Fabric Act for many years. And their organizers are here today to share about how they approach the fashion policy process to ensure that workers have a seat at the table. Real quick, before we get started today, I am dropping in the chat instructions if you'd like to turn on closed captions on your Zoom. And we will go ahead and get started. Okay, so why does this orientation matter? Why are we here today to talk about worker-centric, justice-oriented policy in the fashion industry? Though well-intentioned, a lot of legislation can rely on a top-down approach, and this happens in the fashion industry as well. We might be interested in pushing for sustainability, but if we rely on a top-down approach, it can create a lot of significant hidden unintended consequences for suppliers or workers who in most cases disproportionately bear the burden of sustainability and due diligence relative to the power and the margins that they share in the fashion industry. I'm going to drop a great piece of research in the chat from our colleagues at the Transformers Foundation if you'd like to hear more about how that comes into play from a supplier's perspective. But here today, we're talking about a worker's perspective because these issues can also create further downward pressure on workers and thus on wages. So we believe that a worker-centric approach that pushes power up from the bottom and shifts legal responsibility for remedy to both brands and their suppliers is the way to spark collective action and shared responsibility rather than passing the buck for responsibility down the fashion supply chain, if you will. So rather than giving you endorsements alone, on today's call, we really want to give you tools and critical thinking skills so you can make informed decisions about what fashion policy you support and why you support it. So to share a little bit more about our thinking on this, I'm going to call up my colleague Becca, who's going to share with you a little bit about Remake's fashion policy philosophy.
Thank you, Em, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. So at Remake, we believe that there is not necessarily one silver bullet piece of legislation that can address all the human rights and environmental injustices that plague the fashion industry. But our perspective is that there are certain broadly applicable provisions or mechanisms that could and should be included in the vast majority of apparel and textile legislation to ensure that it not only results in actual corporate behavior change, but that it also best serves the communities most impacted by whatever issues it is endeavoring to address. And these provisions are largely to do with what Aisha has coined up-chain accountability. This is the notion that because of the power dynamics in fashion, it's the wealthy and influential brands and retailers at the top of the value chain that have long benefited from exploiting workers and polluting the communities where they produce and discard clothing, that bear the ultimate responsibility for the human rights and environmental outcomes that occur throughout the life cycle of their products, right from design and raw material extraction through to the end of life and post-consumer phases. So good textile legislation would thus ideally include upchain liability mechanisms. So based on the premise of upchain accountability, upchain liability means that fashion brands and retailers are held legally and thus financially accountable for mitigating and remedying adverse human rights and environmental outcomes that occur within and as a result of their value chains. An example of such a mechanism would be ensuring that all mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation establishes joint liability by making brands partially liable for any violations that occur in their manufacturing facilities, even when they do not have direct ownership of those factories. Or it could be the inclusion of a mandate in any extended producer responsibility legislation, for example, that requires financing to flow from the fashion brands that are churning out the millions of garments every year to where the clothing is ultimately ending up in the communities that end up managing the inevitable waste. Why is upchain liability important? Well, we've had 30 years or more of voluntary corporate social responsibility efforts with brands and retailers increasingly promising to grow their sustainability commitments, and yet progress has stalled when it comes to the industry's human rights and environmental impacts. We've seen top-down approaches that lack any kind of binding mechanisms or direct supplier and worker engagement, resulting in fashion companies putting a lot of the risk onto their suppliers when it comes to taking on the responsibility of things like decarbonizing manufacturing processes or paying workers living wages, as Emily mentioned before. And so despite all the lofty commitments made by companies over the years, they're not only coming up short, but they're also not acting as true partners to the people they depend on to bring their products to life. This incremental progress, with a lot of it being focused on greenhouse gas emissions and materials, continues to come at the expense of supply chain workers, most of whom live and work in the same communities experiencing the worst impacts of the climate crisis.
Thank you, Becca. We'd now like to share with you a little bit more about the second aspect of our policy philosophy, which is ensuring that worker voice is represented and centered in fashion policy. And so here to share more about this, I want to welcome Anahi and Gloria from the Garment Worker Center, who can share with you a little bit about how this was brought into play in the Garment Worker Protection Act, SB 62 in California, and now the proposed Federal Fabric Act. Anahi, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Anaí Cruz. I'm a coalition coordinator for the Garment Worker Center. The Garment Worker Center, a little bit of background before I pass it over to my colleague Gloria. The Garment Worker Center, we're a workers' rights organization leading the anti-sweatshop movement. We're based out of downtown LA, here in California. We engage in policy advocacy and more like on-the-ground organizing. Gloria here is an organizer. I'll have her share a little bit more about her experience, but we reach our membership base of garment workers throughout the LA area by on the ground, just outreach. And then once they're part of the organization, they have access to a wage clinic. If they experience wage theft, we can help them out with that. Leadership development, just a whole plethora of resources and support. And really the goal and the mission of the Garment Worker Center, we're an organizing organization. So workers, we empower workers to be able to organize themselves, know their rights, and even organize their factories and get involved in this kind of work. So enough about that. I'll pass it over to Gloria to introduce herself. I'll also be translating for Gloria as she gives a little bit more of a context of her work and what it is she does, because Gloria really is the heart of our work with policy. Gloria, te paso el micrófono para que te presentes y luego podemos empezar a hablar un poco de lo que haces en tu trabajo.
Pues hola, buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Gloria. Pues yo soy una organizadora con el Centro de Los Ángeles, con el Garment Worker Center. Pues yo anteriormente fui costurera por 15 años y ahora mi trabajo es ser organizadora, ¿verdad? Con los costureros. Pues Yo llevo 2 años ahorita dirigiendo un comité de 25 a 30 trabajadores de costura que se reúnen mensualmente para mover nuestras campañas, compartir testimonios con los medios de comunicación. También toman roles, ¿verdad? Para dirigir nuestra junta o poner presión a los políticos, ¿verdad? A los que tienen el poder de hacer esos cambios y el año pasado estuvimos yendo al DC también para juntarnos con senadores y con los representantes y estuvimos igual viajando en Sacramento para movilizar este trabajo, también tomando decisiones con los comités mediante de votos, siempre involucrando a los miembros, ¿verdad? Los comités, ellos son los que deciden qué queremos seguir, por cuál camino tomar, ¿verdad? Anay?
Gracias, Gloria. So hi, my name is Gloria. I was formerly a garment worker for 15 years. I'm now an organizer with the Garment Worker Center for the past 2 years. I lead a committee of 25 to 30 garment workers who meet monthly to engage in advocacy for our campaigns. They share testimonies in the media, meetings with electeds, who Gloria mentioned are the ones who have the potential to help us create this change. We've previously traveled to DC and Sacramento to lobby and meet with electeds, representatives, and senators. And the committee also makes decisions about how to move the campaign forward and how to mobilize workers and our allies. They make decisions as a committee by voting, and they work together to decide what's best for the campaign.
Ya, pues la experiencia de los trabajadores es lo que motiva sus fuertes implicaciones en este trabajo. Están cansados de tanto sufrir, ¿verdad? Tanta explotación que han sufrido del pago por piezas, les pagan por centavos. Pues los trabajadores se organizaron junto con el Centro de Trabajadores de la Costura para movilizar actividades y divulgaciones entre aliados y otros trabajadores. Ellos son los verdaderos afectados porque ellos son los que sufren las explotaciones en su trabajo, tanto como salubridad, ¿verdad? Pues esta ley les protege de los trabajadores, ¿verdad? Porque estuvieron pues, luchando, reuniendo, pues esa campaña llevó años, la SB 62 para que se hiciera ley. ¿Por qué se logró, verdad? Porque hay tantas gentes impactados sobre los robos de salario, hay muchas gentes que están impactados. Esa es la razón que nos organizamos junto con ellos, es por eso que se llevó a cabo, ¿verdad? La campaña.
Yes. The experience of workers is what motivates their heavy involvement in this work. They're tired of everything that they've been through, such as exploitation, wage theft, and piece rate pay, getting paid mere cents for every piece that they produce. Workers organize within the Garment Worker Center and conduct outreach to allies and other workers. They're the ones that are truly impacted by this work, and they want to see fair wages and justice. Our campaign advocating for the Garment Worker Protection Act, or SB 62, here in California was a several-year campaign, and the law was informed by the experiences of garment workers.
Ya, pues durante la pandemia, ¿verdad? Es cuando más se unieron porque vieron tantas cosas que pasó, pues más que todo, mucha gente se fallecieron en esa pandemia. Pues los costureros fueron esenciales para la pandemia. Ellos hicieron las mascarillas para los enfermeros, los doctores, ¿verdad? Ellos hicieron los trajes de los doctores, pues estuvieron duramente trabajando en la pandemia. Es por eso que estuvimos viajando en Sacramento, llevamos 2 autobuses para que ponerle presión al gobernador para que firmara esa ley y es cuando se logró a que firmaron la ley porque pues tantas gentes fueron impactadas.
So we were able to march and hosted caravans of 2 buses filled with workers to Sacramento to meet with electeds and share testimonies and also to put pressure on the governor to sign this bill into law. During the pandemic, garment workers were essential workers making hospital gowns and masks, and I think workers became more involved because they were the ones suffering directly. Many workers died during the pandemic.
Ya, pues de la ley SB 62, de eso se surgió la ley Fabric, ¿verdad? La ley Fabric, porque la SB 62 solo tenemos aquí en California que eliminó el pago por pieza. Es por eso que sirvió de modelo la la ley SB 62. Es por eso que nos estamos uniendo ahorita, ¿verdad? Para expanderlo en todos los Estados Unidos para que se haga ley a nivel nacional para eliminar el pago por pieza para todos los trabajadores, pues ya es tiempo que se haga una justicia, ¿verdad? Que ganen un salario justo en todos los estados. Pues nos hemos reunido con trabajadores de Texas, con trabajadores de Nueva York, ¿verdad? Que ellos sufren lo similar de lo que está pasando aquí, de lo que mirábamos aquí en California, del pago por pieza, del pago por centavo. Ellos tenían que trabajar muchas horas. Es por eso que es importante, ¿verdad? Que ahorita estamos haciendo alcances con tanto con otros organizaciones en otros estados y conexión con trabajadores en otros estados porque sabemos que en esta industria hay miles y miles de trabajadores en otros países, en otros estados de aquí en Estados Unidos. Por eso es importante que nos unamos, ¿verdad?, para presionar al Congreso para que se haga cambio.
So for the passage of SB 62 came the Fabric Act. SB 62, since it's only here in California, has served as a model for the Fabric Act because workers want to see this change at the national level. Many government workers in the US are still being paid per piece, and they want to see some justice throughout the country. We have met with workers from Texas and New York and learned that they experience the same things that we do, which is why it's important to reach out to other organizations and workers in other states, which we've been doing. There are thousands of people that can join this fight nationwide, and that is why it is important that we come together to pressure Congress to make this change.
Ya, pues nos hemos reunido con la mayoría de los representantes de aquí de California este año. También del año pasado estuvimos en Washington, D.C., reuniéndonos con representantes, con senadores para pedir que apoyen esta ley y nos ayuden a eliminar esta injusticia. También hemos realizado acciones por correo electrónico. Nuestros aliados han mandado correo electrónico hacia los senadores, igual nuestros miembros han hecho llamadas y llamadas para ponerle presión a los electos, ¿verdad? Que ayuden, que apoyen, ¿verdad? Pues por eso le pedimos también que a nuestros aliados, ahorita tenemos 22 representantes apoyando esta ley Fabric y también tenemos 10 senadores apoyando por ahorita. Así que la lucha sigue y seguiremos. Gracias.
So we have met with the majority of California representatives. And last year we were in Washington, D.C., meeting with representatives and senators, asking them to support the Fabric Act and asking them to help us eliminate these injustices. We've also had email and call-in day actions to pressure electeds with the help of all of our allies. And so far we have 22 representatives supporting the bill and 10 senators. And as Gloria said, la lucha sigue, the fight continues. And so this is an ongoing campaign. Thank you, Remake, so much for inviting us to speak on this a little bit. Gracias a Gloria for sharing her experience. Like I said, Gloria is really the heart of the campaign team because she's the one that's there with workers and getting their stories and making sure that they're included in this work. So I'll pass the mic back to you all, but thank you all so much.
Thank you. And if we can all give a warm Remake round of applause to Anahi and Gloria. Thank you so much for joining and for sharing about this important work. So we've shared a little bit about why a worker-centric and justice-oriented lens on fashion policy matters and how Remake analyzes if a policy accomplishes those things. Now we want to give you all the tools from our toolbox to be able to make that analysis yourselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Becca, who's here to share some real-world tools with you all.
Thanks, Gloria, and thanks, Anahi. That was fantastic. The Fabric Act and SB 62, as we've heard, was developed by workers for workers. There is a lot of other fashion policy up on the table and coming down the pike. And so today we're going to share with you a couple of preliminary questions that you can ask policymakers and architects of legislation to be able to discern for yourselves whether you want to support a specific bill or not, and to be able to then advocate for any necessary amendments to strengthen legislation. So firstly, and I think probably most importantly, is asking what stakeholders have been consulted in the development of a piece of legislation. And I would urge you to think about what issues the bill is attempting to address and what communities it will serve. and what communities it will have unintended consequences for, and then have representatives from those communities being included in the writing of the bill. So to take it back to SB 62 and the Fabric Act, as we said, it was developed by garment workers for garment workers. And so we know that the issues that the bill is attempting to address in the communities that it serves were directly involved in the development of that legislation. Secondly, asking what stakeholders is this piece of legislation trying to hold accountable, and what accountability mechanisms are in place to actually ensure that in practice they are indeed accountable. And so this goes back to the up-chain accountability piece that I spoke to earlier. And then again with SB 62 and Fabric, the accountability mechanism in these bills is the joint liability aspect. So brands and retailers, as well as manufacturers and factories, are held responsible for the wage theft and labor violations in their supply chain. And so those bills are trying to hold brands and retailers as well as manufacturers accountable, and the joint liability is the accountability mechanism. Thirdly, who is supporting and advocating for the bill? This is quite a tricky one, and it's not necessarily black or white, but it's sometimes a bit of a red flag if only the stakeholders the bill purports to hold accountable are in favor of it, and the communities it claims to intend to serve or related environmental justice communities are in opposition to it. In California, with SB 62, a lot of big brands and industry associations were opposed to the bill because it would essentially raise wages for the workers in an industry that consistently tries to squash wages and prices in this race to the bottom. And these bills have, by and large, been supported by smaller, responsible companies that need the playing field leveled for them. And so, yeah, that's quite an interesting one. So then with all of this in mind, once you've sort of looked at these questions and done a bit of digging, who else perhaps needs to be consulted to sort of strengthen this legislation or ensure that it's as effective and status quo changing as can be? And then what other general questions or concerns might you have? And then using these questions, I would really encourage you to write to the architects of whatever piece of legislation, to the advocacy groups that are pushing this legislation, and ask them these questions, and hopefully you can get some answers and create a dialogue so that we can really try and ensure that whatever fashion policy is coming down the pipeline is as robust as possible, and that really changes the status quo of the industry rather than sort of cements the status quo. So with all this in mind, and with the broader mission of creating a race to the top in a power supply chains, we'd love to dig more deeply into the importance of joint liability as an accountability mechanism within legislation. So joint liability is the notion that two or more parties are legally responsible for paying back a debt or otherwise covering a liability. As alluded to in laying out our policy philosophy, in the case of fashion supply chains, joint liability refers to the idea that both brands and retailers and their subcontracted factories should legally owe a duty of care towards garment workers and the upholding of human and labor rights in manufacturing facilities. And this is why SB 62 was so groundbreaking. For the past several decades, fashion brands and retailers have purposefully distanced themselves from their suppliers and their supply chains with layers and layers of contracting and subcontracting so that they can feign ignorance and evade legal accountability for the environmental and human rights abuses occurring as a direct result of the downward pressure they place on the factories and workers that make their products. This distance has allowed companies to chase the lowest prices and labor standards around the world in order to secure the highest profits without consequence, thereby creating and perpetuating the global race to the bottom. And so the Garment Worker Protection Act is so groundbreaking because it is the first fashion law that directly addresses this power imbalance, acknowledging that poverty, wages, and poor working conditions are incentivized by the downward pressure that brands and retailers put on their suppliers. SB 62 created a template for joint liability, where fashion companies are legally and thus financially accountable for the wage theft and exploitation that happens in their supplier factories, incentivizing responsible production starting right from the top. And as we've said, the Fabric Act builds on this template with the intention of ensuring that all workers and all companies across the country have these same protections. Joint liability and other up-chain accountability mechanisms in fashion legislation are absolutely crucial if we're to have strong laws that give fashion companies to address and mitigate the human rights violations and climate impacts along their value chains. Without them, we really do run the risk of perpetuating and further entrenching the very power structures responsible for fashion's current trajectory in the first place. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Em, who's going to go further into the Fabric Act.
Thank you for sharing. So like we said, we wanted to give you the tools to be able to analyze fashion policy, and we're going to share these resources with you after the call so you can continue to chew on this. But if you want an example about putting this work into practice today, one such bill that incorporates these important measures, worker voice and joint liability, is the proposed Federal Fabric Act. And I'm dropping the link to learn more about that bill in the chat. As our colleagues from the Garment Workers shared, this bill was developed to build on the Garment Worker Protection Act and address the issue of piece rate pay, and also to build on those joint accountability standards that the Garment Worker Protection Act set as precedent in the state of California. The Fabric Act has received 8 new bill co-sponsors this month, bringing that to a total of 9 Senate endorsements and 24 in the House of Representatives. And if you want to continue to support this kind of worker-centric, justice-oriented fashion policy, we are seeking volunteers who want to help us state by state to get this bill passed. In particular, we are looking for volunteers from the following states. I'm going to drop them in the chat, but of course we'll take anybody who wants to support this work. Please feel free to reach out to me, Emily Stokel, anytime on the Remake Ambassador Slack, or shoot us an email if you are having trouble accessing these resources and want to get more involved. So I want to pause here and open it up to questions that may have come up as we've gone over this, whether this is questions about joint liability, questions about the Fabric Act. We are happy to address those now. I see we've got a raised hand from Debbie. I would invite you to come off mute and ask your question, or to drop it in the chat. Either is fine.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. I've learned a lot. My question is around how would you be able to implement something like this from scratch? Let's say you were trying to establish like a new warehouse, say in a country in Africa where maybe none of these things exist. What would be the ideal way to kind of like get started, as you know, from that bottoms up approach?
Yeah, I can start, and I'd love to hear, Anahi and Gloria, your perspective as well, if you're able to share. But I think the first step, as Gloria mentioned, is just connecting with the workforce in that community and creating a space or convening where they can all share more about the issues they face and discuss collaboratively the solutions. I'd love to turn it to our Garment Worker Center colleagues if you'd like to chime in more about like how to start from the ground up in terms of like building worker solidarity around solutions.
Yeah, let me translate the question really quick.
Thank you.
Gloria, la pregunta es que si, ¿cómo es el mejor como método o el mejor proceso para empezar desde abajo para arriba a implementar cambios así como en una fábrica, para que beneficie a los trabajadores y sea más como ética y más responsable, empezando con los trabajadores? Emily acaba de compartir que debe de empezar con los trabajadores, hacer alcance con ellos, crear un espacio donde ellos pueden compartir sus preocupaciones y ahí empezar. No sé si quieras compartir algo, Gloria.
Sí, también, bueno, nuestro trabajo, ¿verdad? Como organizador, también hacemos alcance en las fábricas. Tenemos otros compañeros de trabajo, hacen alcance en diferentes regiones, como en Huntington Park, en el Monte, Sur Centro o en el centro de Los Ángeles. Yo me dedico en el centro de Los Ángeles cuando, ¿verdad? Puedo, también voy a ir a hacer alcance en las fábricas, hablar con los trabajadores de ahí adentro cuando nos dejan entrar en las fábricas. A veces no nos dejan entrar, pero nos ponemos enfrente de las fábricas para hacer alcance y ellos nos dicen, nos cuentan de lo que están viendo en su fábrica, digamos, tanto como de salubridad. Y les dijimos, entonces, ¿cómo está tu fábrica? Y nos dicen, oh, no, pues hay tantas ratas o cucarachas o como el mal pago, ¿verdad? Que no nos están pagando, estamos trabajando tanto, muchas horas y nos están pagando 8 centavos, 6 centavos y ya les decimos, ¿y te gusta eso o te gustaría ver un cambio? ¿Cómo te gustaría mejorar? ¿Cómo quieres que se mejore tu fábrica? ¿O cómo podemos trabajar junto contigo para que se vea esa mejoría? Y así los involucramos. Y así se involucran y ya les damos seguimiento, cuáles son los procesos, ¿verdad? Para, digamos que quieren también abrir un caso, hacer un reclamo que le están robando los salarios y les damos, digamos, como estrategias, cómo recuperar esos salarios que le están robando, están haciendo trabajar por muchas horas y igual tanto como salubridad.
Gracias, Gloria. So Gloria shared that as an organizer, we have several organizers. I think we have about 5 on our team who do outreach in different factories in different regions of LA. I've gotten to go on some of those outreach, and it's literally going inside the factories when allowed. Sometimes it's just waiting outside the door for folks to walk out on their lunch break. And just asking them, what are you experiencing? And from there, they share about their working conditions. Gloria shared that some workers share that they see just rodents and vermin just running around, and it's just very dirty and unsafe. And also about their pay. A lot of folks are experiencing piece rate pay. And so from there, just sharing their experience, organizers make the question, okay, well, are you okay with your working conditions, or do you want to create change? And what change would you like to see? And from there, the follow-up is really how we engage folks, whether it's helping them with their specific issues or empowering them to organize within their factories. That's really like the start of it. So I think that's definitely what I would share as well. It's just speaking to workers, first of all. When I speak to workers and they share their experiences, just the fact that someone is hearing them, it means a lot. And that's how you really start and understand what are the issues. That's how we figured out that piece rate was still a really common practice. And so it's just about engaging workers and starting from there, and then empowering them to mobilize themselves, know their rights, and let them know that, our philosophy at GWC is really like we're kind of like a vessel to give the right tools to workers to be able to organize and stand up for themselves and make those changes. And we just are kind of like the host of these resources. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that answered everybody's question.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I want to take a question that's come up in the chat, which is, this is a global community that's here on this call today. So we talked some about US fashion policy, but folks are wanting to know, how can we get involved beyond that? So I think a couple of things. I think understanding that the incredible work of the Garment Worker Protection Act set precedent not only for how piece rate pay could be tackled here in the US, but piece rate pay is something that happens around the globe. So are these issues impacting workers in your local context? These are questions that you could begin to ask with orgs that you're working with locally. I think also just understanding these questions, because new fashion policy, like we talked about, is coming into play all the time. And so we wanted to give you more of just a lens of how you could look at these things so you can begin to analyze fashion policy that you want to champion. And then how you can help with the Fabric Act if you're outside of the United States. Again, just like sharing resources and sharing tools like this. Becca, if you wanted to chime in more, I'd be happy to share.
Yeah, I wanted to also say that a lot of the bills that have been precedent setting that have passed in the United States, like the Weaker Forced Labor Prevention Act, there's a movement to address the de minimis loophole in the US. One country can't tackle those issues alone, and we need broader alignment. And so I think knowledge sharing between what's working, what can be improved with legislation that's being passed, like constantly communicating so that in the UK perhaps that there are similar policies to prevent the bifurcation of supply chains, so that goods tainted with weaker forced labor are not, instead of being shipped to the US, instead being shipped to the UK. So we really need to tackle these issues from all angles and to have a global alignment for good, strong policy. So I think knowledge sharing is key as well.
Awesome, thank you. We've got another question in the chat about joint liability. So the question is, if there are 20 brands working in a single factory, so, as we all probably understand, the way that the fashion industry works is we have a factory and then we have many brands who are all sourcing from that same factory. What would be the idea of a lawsuit that targets them all? Would that liability and payouts be spread across the brand? So the idea behind joint liability, as Becca shared previously, is that rather than having all liability and responsibility on the manufacturer and the factory, that liability is also shared by the brands who create the power dynamics. So whether that be the prices that they're setting, the timelines that they're setting, they are considered a joint employer essentially for that workforce. Becca, if you'd like to add more to that.
I was going to maybe ask Anahi to provide some context on perhaps how it's working in California. If you have any insight into that, Anahi.
Yeah, in our particular space in the wage claims that we've been working with, I haven't heard too much movement around targeting a specific brand or anything like that yet. I think it's still fairly new in California, but we've definitely see the impact of like the piece rate system and the elimination of that and minimum wage. I will say that when filing a wage claim with the state of California, and I assume it's most likely going to be the same at the federal level, the evidence that needs to be collected, the burden is often on the worker. So something that we really encourage and teach our workers is to look at the brands that they're producing for, take pictures of the tags. That's really often such a key indicator for who they're producing for. Collect them if they can. And also to know more about their employer, and just collect much evidence as they can to be able to first even identify who would be held liable. It's often very difficult to, whether it's like the brand itself or the factories, they keep it very close to their chest who it is that they're working with. So unfortunately, that burden of evidence is something that our workers are tasked with. So I'm not sure if that answers the question directly, but I think that's also probably one of the reasons why it's going to be a bit more difficult to take on these like larger brands. But the fact that we have that mechanism there is essential in itself. So I think we'll be able to see a lot more of that in the next coming years. And I've already kind of heard of some brands that have been repeat offenders just from our worker experience. So I can only imagine throughout the country. And yeah, so that's kind of what I can answer about that right now.
That's
And I
really
think it's a question sort of also raises the point that the devil is in the details. And as these bills play out, you know, working hard to ensure that they're not placing an unfair burden on these small responsible brands who needed the level playing field in the first place. And so I think there is a lot of work to be done and things to be seen as things roll out, and a lot of learnings from California that can be applied across the country.
And I also wanted to share with folks that joint liability or joint employment is something that you might see in the news here in the United States. If you see news coming out of the National Labor Relations Board about joint employment, or I shared an article in the chat about how very recently the Teamsters won a joint employment lawsuit because they were being subcontracted by Amazon as delivery drivers, and they were able to get essentially joint liability, joint employment provisions in that context too. So once again, it's precedent setting and something that sets a standard for the industry beyond just apparel as well. We've got another question in the chat, and I think this is also probably a question for the Garment Worker Center. But the question is, are workers ever worried about factories knowing that they're documenting these kinds of things? So Anahi and Gloria, maybe you could talk about how you protect worker safety when you're tackling these issues.
Yeah, thank you. Gloria, lo que acabo de discutir un poco es sobre el proceso de poder a encontrar una marca como responsable por robo de salario. Y mencioné que la responsabilidad de encontrar evidencia es lo que se le pasa a muchos los trabajadores. Los trabajadores son los que están anotando a cuáles marcas, con quién están contratados, la fábrica. Y alguien acaba de preguntar que si los trabajadores están preocupados sobre que las fábricas estén notando, que ellos sepan por cuáles marcas se están produciendo. ¿Puedes hablar un poco sobre el proceso y qué consejos les damos a los trabajadores sobre recolectar evidencia?
Sí, siempre cuando tenemos un mini entrenamiento con ellos, ¿verdad? Con los trabajadores, cómo colectar evidencia para saber para qué marcas están trabajando. Lo que hacemos es para ponerle presión a esta marca que pague más, responsabilizar a la marca, que pague bien al contratista, ¿verdad? Para que él pague bien a sus trabajadores. Y lo que hacemos, pues pueden tomar una foto de la marca que están haciendo o el número del corte de lo que están produciendo, y así podemos poner presión a esta marca. Incluso hemos ido a hacer, poner, llevar carta en la mera oficina de la marca. Hemos hecho delegaciones con un grupo de trabajadores para poner presión a esta marca. Hey, paga, tienes 5 trabajadores que están trabajando para ti, están produciendo tu marca y no le estás pagando bien poquito a ellos. Y eso es lo que les hacemos a ellos, que tengan evidencia, que tengan una prueba, o que tomen foto donde ponchan ellos, porque a veces les hacen ponchar. Tomen la foto que están ponchando para que, o el número de la licencia que tiene la fábrica de ahí, para que tengan que sí trabajaron en esa fábrica. Y es importante colectar todas las pruebas hasta pues agarrar la placa del patrón, porque a veces los patrones usan otro nombre y no es el nombre que ellos tienen. Le digo, es mejor tener cualquier evidencia que tengan, le digo, y eso es lo que hacen. Encuentran las evidencias que ellos pueden, y así pueden recuperar el salario, no importa que no tengan papeles. Siempre les decimos, no tengan miedo que son indocumentados, porque sabemos que casi la mayoría que tenemos en nuestra organización son indocumentados, y siempre les decimos, a veces tienen ese miedo, no, es que no tengo papeles, tengo miedo de reclamar mis derechos. Le digo, no, en este país todos debemos tener derechos, somos gentes humanos y somos trabajadores. Gracias.
Gracias, Gloria. So Gloria shared that we train our workers extensively on how to collect evidence. We often collaborate with the Department of Labor here, or the Labor Commission here in California, to kind of understand what it is that would even be considered evidence for the Labor Commission. So we ask workers to identify the brands, and sometimes we even go directly to the brands to put pressure. So we ask workers to kind of note order numbers, any tags, or any information that they can. Take pictures if they can, if they feel safe to do so. And then we choose to escalate from there. So in some instances, we've gone directly to the factory, for example, and delivered a letter from the workers with the changes that they would like to see before escalating. So sometimes we give them a chance. It's just depending on if the workers are willing to do that and if we have like a committee of workers. And then if oftentimes the factories won't respond to the workers and their asks, and we go to some of the contractors that they're contracted with, or the brands that they're contracted with, and we say, hey, you're working with this factory that is stealing wages and it's an unsafe condition. Just want you to know that this is who you're working with. And we've had a recent experience where we went out and we created this delegation, and one of the brands that was producing work to this specific factory mentioned, okay, well, we're going to stop working with them until they pay their workers. And so that's another mechanism that we have that's more grassroots and directly coming from workers. And really the workers are the ones, the committee of workers from this factory are the ones that decide on how to escalate. And, you know, we again emphasize workers to just take pictures of anything and everything they can. And we also remind folks that even if you are undocumented, a large part of our workforce in California isn't documented. You have rights, and you have protections that will protect you. So you're able to stand up for yourself and not be afraid to collect that evidence and state the change that you want to see.
And confirm, Anahi and Gloria, that this is why it's so important that we pass the Fabric Act at the federal level, because it will ensure that workers have more rights, that they have access to remedy and a path to escalation, more so than without these bills.
Thank you all. Well, I am about to launch a little poll on our screen. We'd love to hear from you all what you learned today. As we said, it's very much our intention to give you the tools to analyze worker-centric, justice-focused fashion policy, to share with you how Remake does this, and how you as an advocate can ensure that worker voice is represented in fashion policy. I think we learned so much from our colleagues at the Garment Workers Center here today. I want to give them another round of applause about why that's so essential and why the worker knows best about the conditions in which they're operating and the solutions to propose to how to address them. And again, just wanted to share with you more about Remake's policy philosophy. Like we said, we will distribute those resources to the community after the call, so you can refer back to them. We hope that you do. And I want to turn it over to my colleague Allison, who's going to send us out. No, maybe we're having a tech issue. I will go ahead and send us out. So we wanted to let you know. Oh, hi, Allison. Go ahead.
So sorry, my internet went out for a moment.
You're all good.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to both of our worker partners at the Garment Center. This was a very powerful program. And as Emily mentioned earlier, we will be sending the recording at the CTAs and the slides that we had on the screen out into the Remake Ambassador Slack later today or tomorrow morning. If you are having trouble accessing the Remake Ambassador Slack or the hub, you can email ambassador@remake.world. And if you are not a Remake ambassador, but you are looking to get more involved in how you could make a positive impact in fashion for workers and for the climate, you could learn more about our Remake Ambassador program on our Remake website, which Emily just dropped in the chat as well. So thank you all so much. It was amazing to see you all today. And if you have any other questions, please let us know in the Ambassador Slack or at the Ambassador email.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.